Big Brother is watching you.
Oh.
Listeners, you are warned. This program is not to be listened to.
Welcome to 1984 Today, your one-stop shop for all things dystopia. I'm your host, Mike Friedman. There are many themes we want to explore with this podcast. What constitutes a dystopia and how it comes into being? The nature and dangers of utopian thinking. How we imagine and create art about perfect and imperfect worlds. How we define progress and whether it's a good thing. How technology enables concentration of power and drives social alienation. How to protect and increase individual freedom. So it's a pleasure and a great opportunity to have someone with us now whose work encompasses all of the above and more. Elle Griffin. Elle is the author of The Elysian, a newsletter that goes out to over 11,000 subscribers, sharing nonfiction and fiction on the idea of utopia. She's a fellow with Substack and Roots of Progress. She's a freelance journalist with bylines in Esquire, Insider, Forbes, and more. She has degrees in fashion merchandising and French, and did her graduate studies in Mariology, a field I was unaware of until her bio explained that it's the study of the Virgin Mary. Elle, I'm impressed, intimidated, and most of all curious. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I suppose for our starter, then, I would bring up the fact that you, at least within the Substack community, elevated your profile slightly by responding to one of these ginned-up controversies that bubbles up from the mainstream press every once in a while. In November 2023, Jonathan Katz at The Atlantic wrote an article called "Substack Has a Nazi Problem" about the fact that there were people on Substack who were publishing newsletters and monetizing them who genuinely were racists and white supremacists and white nationalists and, in general, unsavory types. The upshot of his article mainly being that this is a problem that requires censorship and demonetization and deplatforming. And you took the initiative to create an open letter in December, a couple of weeks after that article came out, that was co-signed by quite a few fellow authors on Substack. I'll accept the deep emotional wound of not being invited to sign it on the basis that we didn't know each other then. And your response was that Substack and the people on it should be able to publish what they want because it's important to have an open debate and places where people can gather and discuss things rather than driving them underground. So, to begin the conversation, I'd love to draw you out on how you came across Jonathan Katz's article, what you thought of it in articles like that, with that type of angle, and how you went about writing the open letter, getting it signed, putting it out there, what the response was.
Yeah, I think, I saw the Jonathan Katz article and my first impression was, where are the Nazis? This is a platform I've now been writing for 3 years. And I just have to say that the product design of it is so much different than any other platform I've ever been on. So my letter was actually not to say, we should have free speech. It actually wasn't very free speech absolutist at all. It was really just in this kind of battle against extremism on the internet, I actually think Substack's product design has worked a lot better at that than centralized moderation has on other platforms. I mean, the upset here, Katz's upset was over 16 accounts on Substack that we wouldn't have even heard of if he didn't find them and publicize them. And he admits in the article himself that he went on extremist chat channels to try to find out what the Substack accounts were that were anti-Semitic or hateful. After his article, I went and looked for these accounts, and from what I can understand, only 3 to 4 of them are actually active, and only one of them is making any money, and he's making to the tune of about a couple $100 a month. And from what I can tell of his content, they're like reviews of music albums, not hate speech, as far as I can tell.
A Nazi music critic. That's a new one on me.
So
that almost sounds interesting.
I think people were upset about things that he said off of the platform, and they were also upset that one of the founders of Substack, Hamish McKenzie, invited him on his podcast. So it came off as this like Substack is promoting this guy who I guess has some kind of morally unimpeachable character. And I get it. Like, I wish that even that much hate didn't exist on the platform. But my argument was, other social media platforms have hundreds of thousands of extremist accounts that are actively being promoted and viralized and, yes, monetized. And there can be no doubt that X, Facebook, MailChimp, Beehive, Ghost, Amazon Books, or any other platform one could want to write for host many more hate accounts and are making much more money from them than Substack. And the only difference is they aren't being targeted by The Atlantic, who, by the way, their largest competitor is independent writers on Substack. And if we're going to argue that the founders of a company shouldn't promote hate content, well, yeah, that's a great bar. But then what is Elon Musk doing, and why is that okay? It kind of just seemed like everybody was in this upset over Substack over a couple of dozen accounts. And I just, in my head, I thought that some would seem content to leave Substack only to remain on literally any other platform seemed nonsensical to me.
It also, I mean, maybe I'm coming at it from a more absolutist position than the one you yourself hold, but I just have perhaps a bias in favor of the idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? I think
Absolutely.
It's probably a good thing to know where the Nazis are and who they are. And if there are people that want to get together and, drink Schlitz and wear pillowcases on their heads and have a fire on their lawn, maybe it's important for us to know who they are so that they don't nip out of the shadows and surprise us one day. And it also makes it significantly less sexy when it's quite obvious, as you say, that it's like this one guy, he makes a couple of $100. He has some far out opinions that very few people agree with, obviously, because we know what kind of money he makes, and it shows how unpopular it is.
Right.
Versus keeping, in a way, keeping the ballot secret, so to speak. You never know how popular a film is at the Oscars. It just wins. They don't publish the votes, as William Goldman said, right? So you never really know if it won. Was it by 2 votes that film is the best film? Was it by 1,000 votes?
Well, yeah. And the free speech approach is dangerous. The free speech approach, any kind of censorship is obviously dangerous, because even the deplatforming that happened from Facebook and Twitter, what did they do? They just created Parler and Truth Social, and what ended up happening is all of our major media organizations aren't on there, so we don't even know what's happening there unless you have an account there. Whereas when it was all on Twitter, everybody was reporting on it left and right, everything that was happening, every idea everybody had. I'm not sure that it's better to kick a bunch of people off the platform and create other places where.
Well, sure, and you know what else Nazis do? They buy shoes. What are we going to do? Outlaw Timberland, right? Because they're doing business with Nazis. I mean, it's the type of line of logic that I just think is it's emotionally understandable. It's unseemly and unpleasant, and in my view, incorrect. The attitudes that a lot of these people have. But the idea that there should not be anywhere they can express it other than in the garage of their house or, in a meeting in the woods, I just think that's more dangerous, as you say.
Yeah, and I don't think platforms should be promoting it or allowing it to go viral. I think it's ridiculous that I can be on Twitter for 2 seconds and instantly see the most hateful thing Kanye said show up in my feed without even following him at all. on Substack, it's incredibly hard to go viral. There's no way to do it. You have to follow somebody. It's just
Your readers are there for you.
Exactly.
There's
so I think that's a much safer
between,
approach,
No, I agree. And so I guess I'm curious, especially since it doesn't seem like it was a proper fire under you defense of free speech in an absolute way. What was it in you that snapped and felt you had to respond to this article by Jonathan Katz and the genesis of that open letter?
To be clear, I am an advocate for free speech. I just think that in this case, the argument is over extremism on platforms. And I know that platforms are owned by companies and that companies can have different rules.
Sure.
So I was just
it's not
only
a First
arguing,
Amendment argument. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. In the case of the Katz article, honestly, it's not just him. There were a lot of people before him who have tried to target Substack in the mainstream media. And the worst possible thing that could happen is all the mainstream media organizations vilify Substack to the point that everybody leaves the platform. The platform can't make money, and we have to all make our living writing for The Atlantic again instead of writing for ourselves on Substack. So to me, it is so frustrating to just see Substack steamrolled by the mainstream media over and over again in these kind of culture wars. So after the Katz piece, when I was just, went in and did my own research and tried to figure out like what was the real problem here, I wrote my own Substack note, which is kind of like their Twitter, about it, just saying, things are better here than anywhere else, literally anywhere else on the internet. And the founder of the Substack, Hamish McKenzie, sent me an email just being like, thank you so much for this note. It said, I think it was something like, loved this note, you nailed it. And I just responded back, no, actually, you're nailing it. Thank you for designing the platform this way. And I mentioned to him that I had reached out to The Atlantic and I had proposed a rebuttal piece to them. Nobody got back to me, of course. I am shocked. You lied. And so then I was like, I think I'm going to expand it into my own letter on Substack. And he was like, well, if you do, I'd be happy to help you find people to sign it if you want. And so then I was like, okay, let's just do that then. So I wrote an article. He sent an email out to some people and I sent an email out to all of my people. And I sent them all the draft that I wrote and was like, what do you think? Are you in? And they all signed their names on a Google Doc. And then we published it. We were very aware at this time that there was another writer on Substack who was circling like an opposition letter. So I think that's where the idea of like, let's get signatures came from, because originally I was just going to write an essay. But then since I found out that these other writers were doing an opposition document and they were trying to get signatures, I was like, well, I guess we should do the same thing too. So ended up turning crazy.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, this social media world, and in marketing what they call social proof. Just why is it that, first of all, why is it that what would be considered the most basic middle of the road idea is now considered a kind of rebellious fringe belief in terms of defending the right of people to publish what they want to publish? And second of all, why do we take certain ideas more seriously if they have a bunch of signatures underneath them? I just, the open letter thing, I applaud you for doing it, and I was delighted to see it, and I enjoyed reading it. But I find myself musing on this question. What has happened? The Overton window in our culture somehow has shifted over time, in my lifetime, so much that we actually now have a public discussion which seems to believe that a strong pro-free speech stance is somehow a right-wing or a conservative position, that to be liberal, in quotation marks, is somehow to be wringing your hands about the idea that someone somewhere might be thinking something someone else wouldn't like. It's just a very strange time for these ideas and for us as a society. I mean, that's just my feeling. I'm curious about you, especially since after sending it out, I'd love to know what the response was.
Well, I think that it's actually not very surprising because the response was something that we've been dealing with for thousands of years, which is we call it virtue signaling, but the idea is that we, try to paint ourselves in the white, and sometimes you have to paint somebody else in the black to do that. It's not ideal. It's very, very it doesn't involve reason or logic. It's more emotional than anything. But I actually wrote an article about this recently because David Hume wrote that humans are not rational beings; they're emotional. And so to try to counter that with ration is like one of the biggest challenges of humanity of all time. So I think when I wrote this response, and then the next day the opposition response came out, and immediately, there was a lot of support for my letter. In fact, we had to open up the letter to further signatures because so many people wanted to sign it. I think there ended up being like 500 signatures if we add everyone on notes that signed themselves. But then there was this kind of weird antagonism that was painting the argument as pro-Nazi, anti-Nazi, and the people that were pro-moderation were the anti-Nazis. And so people were actually calling me and many other writers like me Nazis. And that was when I was like, okay, well, so...
Well, that's but that's, in a way...
to be clear, we're both anti-Nazi here. We just have a different idea of what will solve that problem.
I think part of it is also something that's happened in the intelligentsia in Western societies. I mean, in a way it's always been there, but it seems more prominent now, which is a kind of obsession with the way you use language, as if using the language changes the thing described or changes the reality. And so what you said it makes perfect sense to me, not in the sense that I think it's a good way of viewing it, but it makes sense that would be the reaction you got, because, I mean, why do some people identify themselves as anti-fascist or anti-racist? Exactly. It's because you immediately discredit anyone that disagrees with whatever, bill of goods you're selling. Anyone who opposes an anti-racist, in quotation marks, is de facto racist. It's a very clever semantic frame to impose on a discussion to immediately, as you say, make yourself the good person, and anyone who doesn't agree with all of your ideas aligned with the least savory people. Right.
Well, the opposition response called their, I think the headline of the article was something like Substack Writers Against Nazis. And I think, so, I mean, I could have called my piece the exact same thing. I could have given it that same title, because I also don't want to see Nazis in my
Substack Writers Against Nazis and Moderators.
I just think product design has been more effective against, Nazi and hate content than moderation has been, as evidenced by Twitter and Facebook. But I think that, when you see the word Nazi and the word Substack paired together any amount of times, you're just like, oh, this seems like something I need to distance myself from. We're not having that same conversation. We're not calling Twitter the Nazi place to hang out, even though maybe you could call it that.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong.
But if we did.
It's evident that Twitter's new management have significantly altered the type of conversations people are comfortable having on there, or maybe they haven't. This is the bit that maybe I think, maybe I'm being naive, but maybe they haven't. Maybe the difference is, since they aren't, apparently, in quotation marks, using the same techniques of shadow banning and suppressing and what's the word? De-emphasizing the circulation of certain tweets. Maybe the same thing that was there before is there now. They're just not keeping it away from you. So perhaps it's not about emboldening people to come out and say things that other people find offensive or problematic. It could just be that they're not bothering to hide it. I have to, I don't know what's going on under the bonnet over there. I can't say for certain which it is, right? So that's the other thing, going back to this sunlight being a good disinfectant idea, is that's why it's so important to have this stuff out to an extent out in the open. That doesn't mean you're going to, get the nearest right-wing extremist and give them the biggest microphone on the biggest platform. Right. But it just means, it's good to know what's going on, where these people are, what they say, so you can really measure if there's more chatter coming from that corner or not. No?
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
And apart from the suggestion or the inference that you were somehow sympathizing with Nazis because you mentioned that demonetizing them might not get rid of them, shocking concept, I know. There was no really unpleasant pushback from the open letter? Did you get any inquiries from mainstream press to take your perspective, or did you get angry death threats from people who thought you were empowering Nazis and they thought you should stop? I mean...
No, I mean, I did see my letter quoted significantly in the mainstream press, on New York Times and a bunch of other ones, all in articles that painted Substack horribly. But of course, they're from the mainstream media. But the benefit of Substack is that, even my piece that I published, I locked the comments to paid subscribers. And I didn't respond to people on notes because it just was getting, I could see that it was kind of getting out of any kind of realm of logic. So I just was like, I'm not going to just jump in and try to defend myself. It's just going to keep this conversation, in the stream forever. And I didn't want to do that. So for me, it wasn't that crazy. I didn't get any crazy email. I had one subscriber write me a list of why I was evil and ask for a refund. But other than that, it was pretty mild.
In that moment, what did you suddenly discover your refund policy was?
I just gave her a full refund. I mean, anyone who wants a refund, I give her a full refund. But I think that, I had asked her to write me an email being like, I'm so sorry you felt this way. Like, let me know because I thought we were going to be able to have an intellectual kind of debate about it. But then she kind of just was like, your whole personality sucks. So I was like, well,
you know how I've been reading you for 3 years and liking everything you said? Well, now I know you suck. Give me my money back. You're wrong. Nuanced debate. Fantastic.
I know. Just, well, can't be everything to everyone.
Look, I had an episode with C.J. Hopkins, who's a writer you may have heard of, who's going through a court case in Germany because he wrote a book that features, in a very low-key way, features a swastika on the cover as a comment on what he saw as a kind of nascent totalitarianism or fascism in the policy of the German government, which is the country where he's living. And he's being prosecuted for distributing material in support of an extremist organization, which is obviously totally not what he's on about. And after that episode came out, he was great. He was very supportive of the episode and of the podcast, and he shared it quite widely, and we got a bunch of new subscribers, and it was amazing. Once, it was almost like mathematical somehow. As soon as we got above a certain number of subscribers, suddenly I had someone in a comments section sharing something about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's like, I had to look at that and think for a second, who do I want to be? I talked to my wife about it. I really agonized over it. Like, I really don't want to be someone who's deleting someone's comments or who's banning people just because they're responding. I want people to respond. I want to see a lively conversation, a kind of community engagement. And I'm happy to holler back and to be challenged and to defend something if I said something someone wants to pull me up on. And I really, I sat with it. I had to just let it go. And luckily, the fire died down without me needing, it didn't become a kind of troll battle that went on forever. So I didn't need to do anything about it. But it was really instructive seeing myself having that challenge. And since you have a very healthy subscriber base and this experience you're talking about, when you think of your own approach to moderation, I remember CJ, who's very much in favor of free speech and right now fighting essentially a free speech legal fight. And he was saying he shuts people down in the comments or bans them if they cross a certain line because it's his space and he's not a country. So it's different. So I'm very curious if you see it the same way or differently in terms of how you curate your own space.
Yeah, I mean, that is the benefit of Substack is I can fully moderate my space. And I think that is much more effective than Substack choosing how they want to do that for me. I have chosen to create a Substack where there is the CEO of a company and an anarchist in the same comment section because we are talking about politics and business and ideas, and I want us to be able to have conversations about that. I think there needs to be a place for that on the internet. Now, if somebody responds with a comment that just gives a hot take like CEOs should all die, then I will say, I'm sorry, this doesn't, meet my guidelines of the literary salon. I'm afraid you're going to have to back up your position if that's how you feel.
I see that you wrote, I don't like you or your stupid face. Your face is stupid. Go die. Yeah, well, can you please elucidate your nuanced opinion, please?
That doesn't happen very often. First of all, I lock all of my essays. The comments are locked to paid subscribers only, so you would have to pay to say that. I don't know that you would.
Well, people buy tomatoes to throw at people, right? So.
I don't think that's why they bought them.
Sorry, anyway, so continue, please. So when you're moderating,
yeah.
that's your approach, basically, to try and have it be a conversation, and then if for whatever reason it degenerates, then you have to draw a line under it.
Then I just delete it or ban them from commenting. So, yeah, that's easy.
Yeah, it makes sense. And something that's very unique about your approach and your work, which is why I was very keen to speak with you, is you write both nonfiction and fiction. And it's great to have you to talk about that because the fascinating things about dystopia to me come from both directions. They are both the real trends in the world around me and in technology and society that I see that I think are important to discuss and to question, but also the great novels, the characters, the ways people dream up, as I called it in the intro, imperfect worlds. So I'd really love to know why utopia, why perfect and imperfect worlds? What drew you to that direction?
Because everything right now in the media is dystopia. We need a counterbalance. I think that...
Is this when I apologize, by the way?
No, I get why it's an exciting genre. I do think that it has caused some problems in our society in the fact that when you see in all of our, fantasy, not just books, but TV shows, films, everything, video games, that AI is used to create the apocalypse and kill off humanity, and a computer chip in your brain is used for government surveillance, and you only see the dystopian uses for technology or the dystopian, things that governments do, then it just creates this global pessimism. And I think that is very all the rage right now. And I wanted to counter that. There's been this kind of idea of solar punk as a genre, but there's no actual books in that genre. It's just kind of like this idea people would like to see. Yeah, solar punk is it's like this genre where there's all this technology and stuff, but it's used to create this more beautiful pastoral setting. So it's not common. It's just kind of a niche thing that people have taken interest in. But I think we actually do need that. I think we need to see, there was one episode of Black Mirror, I think it was called like San Junipero, where the dot on your temple puts you into a virtual world, and that is used because, as we learn, a quadriplegic and a woman who are dying are able to live out full lives in this virtual world. It is a utopian vision for that technology. It was one of the first, now the fact that the rest of that series was all dystopian and how things can go wrong, I think, is a bummer. But that one episode, that San Junipero, it was hopeful. It was good. There was still a dramatic storyline. There was still curves where we were like, what's going to happen? But it actually gave a more utopian worldview than other.
And it's quite telling, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that episode is the one that won them, was it an Emmy, I think?
Oh, did it? Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah, it was that specific episode that was awarded something in the television world.
Oh, that's so good, because it was so good.
Right, but it's also, there's the old George Clooney line when he was questioned about this in a press conference when he was promoting a film. He said, Americans like a little too much cheese in their souffle. So, is it that that's what people really want, is the hopefulness, the happy talk, or you think people are actually kind of mainlining the bummer, the downer, the negative trip?
I think that is such, everybody always says nobody wants utopian fiction. Everybody only wants dystopian fiction. That's just the way we're wired. And I think that is so not true, because why to this day, what are the most watched television series? It's like Friends and Seinfeld and The Office. Yeah. And these were shows where literally nothing bad ever happens, and every episode you can expect to just be happy. Today, all of our shows are dark and gritty. It's this, big, dramatic, everything is horrible. And then what do you want to do after you watch that? You're like, I'm going to go watch a Friends episode because I need to get my mind feeling right again. And I think we saw a resurgence of that this year when we saw Ted Lasso and how incredible that did. It was like, it was not a sitcom, so it wasn't fluffy. There was dramatic elements. There, people were suffering from mental ailments. Not everything went right, but it was still so positive and uplifting and hopeful. And I think that our whole media landscape needs more of that. It shouldn't be everything is only dystopian saga versus fluffy romance. We can have something that is positive and real and good.
Yeah, I while you were talking, I was listening to you, and I was really feeling like there is a very interesting, almost visceral reaction to this idea of de-emphasizing the negative in the world in favor of something that's lighter or more positive or uplifting, something to do with, in a way, being kind of dishonest or willfully choosing not to see, quote, all the bad stuff, right? And that's not me saying you're doing that. I'm noticing that there is a kind of a knee-jerk. So maybe this idea, people want dystopia. Well, maybe we're fascinated by it. The doom scrolling, the worst case scenarios, the endless lists of all the things that are going wrong or historically wrong. The Freudian death wish of it all, so to speak. But yeah, I do feel like, I don't want to say that we have to have some kind of social realist rule where you need to be constantly banging on about everything that sucks, because that's what's real. Because the joy is real, the happiness is real, the pleasure and the possibility are real. Why do I have that reaction?
This is I don't know because this has just been human nature forever. But I mean, it's the same thing with the Academy Awards. Like, what is everybody saying is going to win the Academy Award this year? It's going to be Oppenheimer. Why wouldn't Barbie win? There's a reason, and it's just because we take serious work more seriously. Every year I attend the Sundance Film Festival. And, this year I have a press pass, and my sole purpose was to go see all of the utopian or hopeful films. Let me just tell you, there are hundreds of films coming to Sundance this year. There are 5 that I want to see that have any kind of hopeful. I mean, they literally, they talk about fracking, they talk about racism, they talk about, disease in third world countries. And there's just this idea that the more depressing and serious the subject matter is, the more seriously we can take that art. And I don't know why it's like that. It really drives me insane because that is not the best art. And when you actually see what people go watch, it's not like everyone's going to watch the really depressing movie all the time. They're just, for whatever reason, when you have to make an actor cry, that seems like harder to do than to make them smile. So that seems like it's more deserving of an award. I don't know. But it's the same thing with Pulitzer Prize winning novels. I went back or Pulitzer Prize winning literature. I went back and looked, and it was like every single one was just horribly depressing. There was, nothing. We don't reward seeing the good in life. We only reward seeing the bad. I don't know why.
And in a way, again, there's this sense, continuing from the reaction I was sharing with you, there's this sense that somehow if I'm reading something that's focused on or emphasizing or entirely about the good or the happy or the joyful, there is some dark, tight, knotted part of me that thinks of it as therefore ultimately false or leaving something out, right?
Right.
I can't tell you why that is, but I see it, and I understand what you mean, and I really do sympathize with your question.
I think it's associated with naivete. I think that if you see a child and an adult standing at the window looking out at the rain, like the adult will be like, "Oh, it's such a crappy day," and the kid will be like, "Puddles," and like both things are true. Like, it is raining and there are puddles, but like, which outlook is the more real? They're both real. You can choose to see that as a positive thing, or you can choose to see that as a negative thing. One is not more real than the other, though. They're both real. So it's 100%. Interesting that I think that when you grow up to see the child's response as being positive, we associate that with naivete. They don't know anything. They don't know yet that rain will make it so much harder to go outside today. Or I don't know. It's just...
Well, they just don't have the same amount of head noise as grown-ups do.
I suppose, yeah.
They're not constantly... Well, maybe they are, but in a different way. Children are not in the same rut of habitually telling themselves a story about their life in their own head all the time, and that is always complaining about what I have to do and where I have to go, and it sucks more if it's raining than if it's sunny, and I like this and I don't like that.
Right.
My approach with this project is in a way aligned with what you're talking about, because I try to keep my sense of humor about this. I do take these things seriously. I do have concerns about certain aspects of what's going on culturally, socially, technologically, and I think it would be kind of part of me feels there would be something irresponsible to take that too lightly, but at the same time, there are some very strange, weird, and funny things going on in the world, and I feel like if we are to survive the 21st century as a society worth preserving, we have to keep our sense of humor and our sense of the ridiculous, because some of this stuff is just laughable. I remember what Mel Brooks said when he was interviewed about The Producers, which of course was his film and then very famous musical, which in its way made fun of Hitler. And he wrote that that came out in 1968. It's 23 years, which proves the South Park theory that everything's funny after 22 years, right? So, it came out and it was controversial. People were like, you can't joke about this. You can't have Dick Shawn playing Hitler and have a musical and, have chicks in SS uniforms high kicking like the Rockettes. That's not okay. And I saw this great line. He said, maybe if more people had laughed at Hitler the first time, he would never have gotten that much power. So I think there's a tremendous, there is a truth in that mockery can serve us well, that ridicule, that refusing to an extent to take some of this stuff or some of these people seriously. Like the Jonathan Katz guy. Why does someone get to determine what is the serious debate? In a way, that's part of the presumption of the media establishment, right? They get to decide when it's a serious question, when we all have to kind of furrow our brows and really not joke about this kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, I have two thoughts about what you just said. I think that you're right. We need to laugh about it. Actually, on the subject of kind of a lighthearted Hitler.
I'm all ears now. Go on.
Jojo Rabbit. Have you
Right.
seen that film?
I haven't actually.
Oh my gosh, it is one of the best films of all time. One of my favorite films of all time. Takes place in Nazi Germany, with a little boy who basically participates in like a summer camp that is like pro-Nazi, where he's like learning to shoot the Nazis as like a little kid. And so Hitler becomes his best friend and his like an imaginary friend that he like goes to for advice. But the whole thing manages to condemn the hatred and take those events very seriously. I mean, the child's mom dies in this Nazi, his friends die, and yet it is such a positive and hopeful movie about humanity. It's a great example of what I think I would say is like utopian in the sense of like a positive worldview, even as dark things are happening.
Like life is beautiful, right?
Right, exactly. And the second thing I want to bring up is I don't think that necessarily like having things like that we could just like laugh Hitler away, or that he wouldn't have come into power if we could have,
That was Mel Brooks, not me. But I know what you mean.
yeah. I think that, we saw up until World War II, like I'm studying humanist literature, and all of these humanist philosophers throughout the world were like largely pacifist, completely like anti-war, until World War II. And then suddenly all of the humanists become pro-war in this one case. Why? Because the people that they were up against were actually anti-humanist. There was this huge anti-humanist movement. A lot of the German philosophers at the time were like, rational thinking and critical thinking is not the answer. What we need is power. What we need is, to just assert what we need, and
Overwhelm the enemy, blood and soil.
Yes, it was all about power. And the humanists at that time realized the only way you can't tamp something down like that by saying you should think critically. And if they could change their mind from being focused on power to being focused on rational thinking, like, no, that's not going to work. They had to meet power with power. They had to go to war against them. They had to fight them down. I think that there's a reason why the Katz article was so upsetting to everybody, and that's because there's everybody remembers World War II, even though we weren't there for it. It was one of the most horrible things to happen in human history, and it was recent enough that we're all like, this is resurging. Like, how could back then we should have stopped things sooner. Can we stop things sooner now? And maybe it should start with on the internet. We notice that people are saying hateful things on the internet. Maybe we should stop it there before it gets into power. Well, we have to remember that the reason why Hitler came into power, the reason why even Putin came into power, they were elected. They were elected before they were even really crazy. I mean, sometimes the craziness helped them get even more powerful because, it was after Hitler was sent to prison that suddenly all of his followers were coming out of the woodwork being like, now we've got to elect them. That like we can see a similar thing playing out with Trump in the way followers are like, bringing anything against him makes him more powerful. And so I think that it's like, laughing isn't going to be enough. But we need to meet it with power. With power, it's just like, where do we meet it, and at what time, and at what place? Like, how do we stop it from infiltrating democracy?
Well, and when you have people who, to use the kind of the OG Nazis, the version 1 Nazis,
right,
as an example, when you have essentially a grievance politics, an ideology that, at least in part, draws on the idea of people who feel that they have been shortchanged, cut loose by their leaders. Stabbed in the back was the big phrase at the time historically. Cracking down on that, trying to silence people, trying to punish them into accepting that they are not in an inferior, subjugated position, plays into that grievance narrative. It plays into their sense of victimhood. When that whole "it's okay to punch a Nazi" thing on the internet happened, where you'd see some alt-right douche getting, slapped in the face while reporting from some protest somewhere, there was a whole meme video thing of people going around and just wanting to hit someone in the head, whoever had a side parting and was wearing khakis, right? And it's just like, well, these are people who say that their opponents are unreasonable and violent and that they are not safe in their own country, which is why they want to be idiots about how to, quote, take their power back. You're not going to convince them that they're wrong by making them feel like they're being victimized and justifying it morally. Like that's not a winning strategy.
Right. I mean, I think that one great thing that authoritarian leaders do that draws a lot of attention to them is that they focus on all the bad things that are happening. They don't say, here's a solution to the problems we're facing. They say, here's the problem. The rich people are getting richer. The poor people are getting poorer. Capitalism is destroying the country. It's holding you down. They point out all the problems, but they don't give it a solution at all. Their solution is elect me. and somehow that's going to change. I mean, Hitler was like anti-communism at a time when everyone was very, very worried about communism and how that would affect their culture. So like, of course, if you're the
and then as soon as he got to power, he
person,
signed a pact with Stalin.
Yeah, and you're the people that are in charge of electing. Then you're like, oh yeah, I'm anti that too. Sign me up. Like it makes sense. It's not even just virtue signaling. It's like I want things to be better than they are.
But that I want things to be better than they are comes with, as you said, a certain caveat from the people giving the pitch that tends to put my back up, which is essentially everything would be better if everyone did what I say. And that seems to be the kind of basic pitch of most people who are putting forward, shall we say, an agenda driven by either grievance or catastrophe. So on the one hand, people who are saying there's something that's either going very wrong or that will go very wrong unless we make sweeping changes. And that's why I should have the power. And there are other people saying that these groups of people are being hurt and subjugated. And so to fix that, I should have the power to empower them, right? It's a very... And it makes me think of this distinction in the sound of the word utopia that I find fascinating, which is that it's utopia, but there's also eutopia with an E on the front. And utopia means no place in Greek, right? And autopia means good place. So it's a utopia.
It's a play on words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a pun sitting somewhere between a place that doesn't or can't exist and a place that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's a sense of the impossibility of that good place that is part of why we prefer talking about the bad stuff.
And, Thomas More, who penned that novel, was very much satirizing the Italy he lived in, and was in a time when it was very dangerous to do so. He was eventually killed because he refused to acknowledge the king's, marriage or annulment of his last marriage. He was a staunch Catholic. So I think that to call it both good place and no place is a little bit way of playing it safe too. Because you're like, well, here's my idea for a better culture, but it doesn't even exist.
I'm not saying that you're doing anything wrong.
Yeah, not that you're doing anything wrong. Just here's some ideas.
Well, and maybe, you are very well versed from your work and your own reading and research in the history of these books about utopian places. And I just wonder, would I be off base if I observed that as the material circumstances of daily life have improved, child mortality goes down, sicknesses are cured, medicine becomes more effective, society becomes more, quite literally, more liberal in terms of who is accepted, who falls within the mainstream, who can walk down the street holding hands with who, and so on. It's disingenuous in the extreme to suggest that society is worse now in the material, self-evident ways than it was.
No, it's way better.
And that's what I mean, that at the same time that that's been going on, we've moved from speculative utopian novels written in dark times to really dark fiction. So what is it, as things get better, why do we have darker dreams?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's the same reason why it's something like the demographic of people who listen to true crime murder is like, it's all just like housewives, middle class, like successful.
Well, who do you think marries the serial
people?
Killers by mail?
I do think you have to be a certain level of happiness to be able to withstand the dark. Like, you're not gonna, if you're living in like a horrible life situation, you wouldn't want to read a dystopian novel. Like, if you were sex trafficked your whole life, like, are you going to want to read a novel in which that happens all the time? Probably not. But if you're like super happy and life is good, why not read it? Because it's fun and it's not any real threat to you.
How the other half lives.
So maybe actually I do have an answer to that question after all.
It sounds like you have a pretty good one.
Because as we get happier, we're more able to withstand the darker. Would be my answer.
See, because I'll never forget when I visited a few places in sub-Saharan Africa, and when I've been there, the music is so cheerful, so upbeat, dancey, major chords, uplifting, happy voices singing in harmony. And then a country like Norway, which regularly is in the top 3 on the Human Development Index, produces satanic black metal. What? Like, what?
Yeah, that actually makes sense if you think about it.
In your way of putting it, right?
Right.
And this is why in dark times, Hollywood and publishing houses, they all suddenly turn into kind of, no, what people want is escape. What people want is the happy stuff. Mm-hmm. But the happy stuff, what passes for entertainment now, Marvel movies and that kind of thing. I can't remember, really. Maybe I'm being disingenuous slightly, but I don't think I can remember the last time I saw a film where the lead wasn't an anti-hero, where it wasn't a flawed person suffering with some serious problem who'd had some awful thing happen to them. A kind of just a strong central character that had real principles and and didn't do terrible things or have some fatal problem in their mind or in their heart. I just don't know if we create or envisage characters like that anymore.
I do think there is a case for, okay, I have maybe a controversial opinion on this, because
Hit me. Love it.
don't you kind of feel like the anti-hero maybe is causing people to think about things more traumatically, or to feel like they have more trauma in their lives? I'm talking about like mental health. I feel like mental health is maybe an issue that is, for example, I have friends who are very, very upset because they were once shoved into a locker by a high school student when they were in high school. And that still traumatizes them to this day. And that was like a huge trauma for them. Whereas I was like, oh, yeah, I was bullied really hardcore in high school too. But like everybody was. It's not traumatic. It's just like, it's just a part of life. Like I don't see that as a trauma. And then I read this study that was about miscarriage throughout the world and how different cultures look at it. And it was saying that in places where miscarriage is really, really common, it's not actually that. It's not seen as a trauma. It's just like seen as an everyday thing. People will be like, "Oh, I had a miscarriage. Oh, I'm sorry. That sucks." But they have a different relationship with it. Whereas in the US, having a miscarriage is like a serious trauma, because in our head we imagine that it never happens, and so it feels like this rare trauma. And I kind of feel that TV is doing this to us, where it's making it seem like everything should be a trauma, and then we associate it as a trauma. One example that I thought was a great counterbalance was also a Taika Waititi film, which was The Hunt for the Wilder People. It was the first time I've ever seen a foster youth not portrayed as a traumatic character. Every time you ever see a high school or middle school kid as a foster kid in a movie, this is a hugely traumatized individual. And The Hunt for the Wilder People was the first time I saw that, and I thought, oh, this doesn't have to be a traumatizing experience. Like, this kid is thriving, he's doing well. Same with Schitt's Creek, when they decided to have a worldview in which, being associated with any kind of like LGBTQ community was not a trauma. They decided that was not going to be a trauma in their show. You have these gay characters, and none of them are ever dealing with that being a trauma. And how much, that would be so much better for today's youth to see that you can be gay, or you can identify as queer, and that doesn't have to be a traumatic thing. Whereas even though most media will portray it as this horribly depressing and horribly traumatic thing, I think that we need to stop having so many traumatic anti-heroes that are just completely traumatized. We need to have characters that can have bad things happen to them and still not be traumatized by them, because that's normal. That's part of life.
And to be resilient is not the same as being unfeeling. Exactly.
I've had horribly traumatic things happen to me in my life, but I choose not to see them as a trauma. And I think that's better.
I wonder, if I read a book by Hemingway, for example, not to choose him for him, but as part of a generation of writers.
Don't get me started on Hemingway.
Oh, okay, here we go. Well, just to kind of, if you read Henry Miller, one of these guys from that generation, you read the bio at the beginning of the book, and all these guys, and of course, yes, I know, they were almost all guys. That's a whole other conversation. I'm not promoting that as a desirable thing, but they were all served in the military, drove an ambulance, was on the front line, was a cub reporter on a crime beat. They lived in the world. They had experiences in a rough and tumble, difficult, uncertain environment where they themselves lived and met other people who were living in the raw, who were living a difficult experience or a difficult life. And then they leveraged that experience of human beings into literature. So even if they were people who wanted to be writers from when they were teenagers, they didn't come out at the age of 21. Like now, having not really ever seen someone crying about anything other than a bad grade or a wedgie, I'm going to write about suffering. Or a singer who comes out and releases a single at the age of 19 about love. And it's like, yeah, I'm not kind of putting down the idea that younger people don't have deep experiences. I just mean that
you can have trauma and not be traumatized.
Sure, but also that the knowledge of extremity, the real gamut of human emotions, going through that perhaps leads to a different picture of how people are shaped. And when we have a kind of television or media-driven idea of how people are shaped, when a writer goes about constructing a character, at least a writer who's kind of trained through the accepted methods, you want to have a character who's flawed. They have to have something happen to them that introduces this kind of negative flow into their being. And so, that's why you have so many central characters who lost a child. It's like the off-the-shelf writer's solution to, how can we have this character be haunted? Well, they lost a kid when they were younger. Boom, done. Right. So this idea, in a way, it feels to me like part of what you're saying is, when we are it's a postmodern idea, really, that when we're culturally influenced by media, where our experience of the world is watching things about the world, we are learning about our fellow human beings based on how the fake human beings in the story world are shaped. Yes. Which leads us to think, oh, well, if something negative happened to me in my childhood, then that is now my flaw for my life, perhaps.
Exactly.
And when you live in the real world, you see that people have awful, unbelievable experiences and then go win a Nobel Prize or swim across the Atlantic or just have a wonderful family life and don't show any kind of pathology about their negative experiences. So I think you're really onto something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of funny, like John Wick tries to satirize that idea because it's like,
it's about his dog.
Yeah, his trauma is his dog dying.
They killed my dog.
He goes way over the handle about it. But I think that's kind of making fun of our modern culture to like be so traumatized by something that you're like going on full war. I mean, that's a common theme in a movie. So
well, you got to have an inciting incident anyway.
Yeah, the inciting incident, that causes you to go crazy. We don't have to be like that in real life.
Yeah, and we another thing that came up when you were speaking is Jean Baudrillard, the philosopher. Have you ever read a very short book of his called The Spirit of Terrorism?
No.
And I'm not going to encourage anyone to read Baudrillard, don't worry, but in that book, he hits upon a very interesting idea where he's talking about, it was his kind of philosophical response to 9/11. And to suicide terrorism more broadly. And one of his observations was that the Western world, if that is a definition that still holds meaning, is a society that has shaped itself on the basis of defeating death. That we want to be alive. We worship youth. We worship longevity. We want to stay alive as long as possible. We want people not to die. We want people not to be infirm and not to be sick. And therefore, a society which at its heart has this total abhorrence of infirmity and death, and in a way has almost banished the acceptability of the shadow part of our existence out of our worldview, to be challenged by people who worship and seek death and do not want to preserve their own lives is like a clash of polarities that can never be reconciled. And I've never forgotten that observation, and I feel like it's related to what we've been talking about as well.
Well, I think even then, those are people that, I mean, from what I understand, the suicide, what are those called? Suicide violent episodes.
Well, they're not always bombers, so
Yes,
I guess you just say
not always
suicide terrorists. Yeah.
Okay, suicide terrorists. Like, from what I understand, that's because the idea of being a martyr is glorified, right? And if you know, in the past, being a martyr meant like somebody was persecuting you for your faith, so you died, you know, believing in your faith. But I think the shortcut to that, yeah, the shortcut to that, if nobody's persecuting you in your religion, is like, oh, well, I'll just go kill myself for the cause and then be a martyr. It's like the glorification of the martyr, at least from what I understand, which is...
Yeah, and it's a valid point as well. But in a way, you know, I guess in a way, to value an eternal life in paradise more than a life on earth is still to value life. And you could argue that people don't necessarily think they really die, which is why they're not actually seeking death. And that could be a broader, more philosophical discussion. I guess that's an argument that holds water. I wouldn't challenge it too much, but my feeling is just that there's something in Baudrillard's point about that there's an almost irreconcilable difference between an individual who worships death and an individual who worships life. And that culturally we've been so terrified and horrified about the negative side of life, or rather what we think is the negative side of life. But in fact, it's just a part of life. Death is a part of life. Like you said about miscarriages, I'm sure they're not pleasant or desirable for the individuals who have them, but they're part of life. They happen. And we have this habit, and we brought it up earlier with the puddles and the rain, right? That we have this habit of determining that something is good and something is bad simply because it's either desirable or undesirable, but one doesn't stop being a natural part of life just because we don't like it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is my case for a kind of humanism, because a lot of religion, if you add in that era of an afterlife, well, there's so much gray area there. We probably can't get on the same page over what we should do with our lives if we have different views on what's going to happen in the afterlife to us, you know. But we can both agree that what happens here, that we should, you know, treat people with kindness and respect, and treat people the way you want to be treated, and don't treat people the way you don't want to be treated. So, like, to me, the humanist idea of like, okay, we can follow the golden rule on life, we can all get behind that, even if different religions have different views on what will happen afterwards.
Well, since you brought up religion, I'm curious if you're willing to circle back to this new to me field of study known as Mariology, or is it Mariology?
Mariology,
I'm pronouncing it wrong. Of course I am.
No.
And two reasons. One, because I'm fascinated by it as a concept, as a study, and I'm curious as to why that was what you wanted for yourself for your graduate studies, but also because a common feature historically in totalitarian systems is either the eradication of religion or the replacement of it with something else. There's Nicholas Goodrich Clark, right, has written quite a lot about his idea that Nazism wasn't a political ideology, it was a religion, and it became the state religion of Germany instead of Christianity, as a kind of hodgepodge of paganism and blood and soil mythology, all that stuff. And you see that with communism as well, the belief that, or historical communism, shall we say, the belief that religion is the opiate of the masses. So I'm curious about where Mariology came into your life, where it sits in terms of your own religious or non-religious attitudes, and why you think it is that regimes that want to control people in a way have to either kill or replace their God.
Okay. Too big
Answers on a postcard, 25 words or
okay.
less. Just kidding.
Okay, so I think I can answer very quickly the people using religion for totalitarian. Um, I don't actually think religion is the impetus of evil. I think it's the impetus of evil and good, depending on how you use it. And people will use religion for evil, and they will use it for good, just as they will any ideology. Um, so I'm not convinced that like having religion or not having religion is like better or worse than anything else. It's just like what do you want to do with it? So I kind of think that it comes back to human intention and whether or not you yourself are a good person rather than the religion itself. And then second, I think that my interest in Mariology came from when I was in my 20s. I do these reading challenges for myself where I like pick something meaty I want to tackle, and then I spend a lot of time reading it. So I read the Bible front to back and studied it as I was reading it. And when I got to the end, I was not satisfied that I understood why we were supposed to believe this religion, and I needed earlier source materials. So I remembered reading at the time that Dan Brown was given access to the Vatican Library to write the Da Vinci Code, and that he was able to study some of the earliest documents of that faith by doing that. And then after he wrote the Da Vinci Code, the Pope shut that down and made it so that civilians could not enter the Vatican Library anymore. But the Marian Library was still available. But the Marian Library, to access it, you had to be a student of Mariology. And anyways, I was interested in that because I was very interested in the feminine in religion more so than I was in the masculine in religion anyways. So I decided to pursue it, and I did get access to the Marian Research Library, which was really incredible, especially because now the program doesn't exist anymore.
They shut that barn door.
The year after I graduated, they closed the Mariology program.
What did you do to piss them off? Why? How did you manage to burn that bridge?
It was kind of funny because I was the only I'm not the only lay person. There were other
Mariologists.
Maybe two other lay people in my program. Everybody else was priests and nuns. So it was a very interesting experience. But yeah, so I went and studied as everything I could get my hands on, and of even earlier time periods than the Bible, because the New Testament, the Gospels are all were all written after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD-ish. So they're far removed from the events that they were writing about anyways. So I wanted to understand kind of like what led up to that and everything. And that's why I pursued my Mariology degree or program. And it was really interesting from that standpoint. I think that, I could go into great depth on what I thought was very interesting there, but ultimately I found that very fascinating, and I did just decide not to be religious at all after that.
Interesting. So you decided not to be religious at all.
I decided to be religious.
It sounds like a wonder. Like
that.
So you mean you decided you were going to be religious and read the Bible and try to believe it? Is that it?
Well, I was reading a lot of the Dalai Lama at the time, and he had this quote about...
My favorite Lama.
He has this quote. He's like, all these spiritual seekers are always coming up, to Dharamsala to get my advice and wisdom. And he's like, what I always tell them is, there are a million roads to peace. Just pick which one you want to be on and stick with it, because otherwise you'll just be spiritually confused and you'll feel like you're always searching for the answer and never finding it. So he's like, just pick one, and then you can be at peace. And I think he said something along the lines of choose whatever faith you grew up in. That'll be the easiest or whatever. So I was like, okay, I'm going to be a Catholic because I've always thought it was beautiful. I love the cathedrals, the stained glass, the smoke and the incense, all that stuff. I thought it was
Who doesn't
beautiful.
love incense and gold?
It was great. The art, the choirs, I could go on and on. So I decided that I was going to be Catholic, but then naturally just approached it like I approached my Catholicism like a researcher and trying to
Your
prove
first
why it
mistake.
existed or why it was true, which obviously I couldn't do.
So you decided to become a Catholic and then
I
did
decided
an
I
un-Catholic
was not
thing like, let's go into this with an analytical framework and try and dissect the origins so that I know for a fact this is historically the basis of my faith.
Honestly, it's really telling about my personality. I wish I could just be one of those people that, just blind
this
faith
sounds
people.
legit. This sounds legit. Cool, I'm in.
But I was like, if I'm going to
line?
believe this and base my whole life around it, then it better be true. So
And how'd that work out for you?
it was not true.
And so your qualified opinion as a bona fide Mariologist who has read the Bible cover to cover and visited and presumably read some of the contents of the Marian library is nah.
No,
is that what you're
that's
saying?
not how I would put it. I still think that it's very powerful. I think, and I would never be an apologist, like trying to convince somebody that their religion is not true, because I still see the beauty of it and why you would want to believe that. And I would not want to take that away from anyone. But I think for me, learning and studying these original texts, like, for example, one thing that Catholics really hinge on is that Mary was a virgin, physically never had sex. But when you study the literature in the original Greek, which the Gospels were written in, Mary, the word for virgin was parthenos, which is a Greek term. It actually meant unmarried at the time. Another famous unmarried woman at that time, Isis, was the goddess in Egyptian culture. But she did have sex. She had sex with Osiris, and that's what, or more dead
Was her
Osiris,
brother,
actually.
right?
I don't know.
I thought he was her brother. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway.
But and that's what caused her to give birth to Horus, who was also called the son of God, and Isis was also called the queen of heaven. She was also called the mother of God. She was, So we see all these terminologies being used for Isis at that time that were then being also used for Mary, and it was kind of like these New Testament authors were like, okay, Isis, like. And, the whole story of that God, like, this is the new ISIS. Like, it would be like today saying they are the Apple of the tech companies. You're like, immediately you know what that means because we're very familiar with Apple and their minimalist design and the white boxes and everything. And that's very much what New Testament authors were doing. And so to attribute the same importance to Mary, they were like, this is an important figure is what we're trying to tell you. And we're saying that she was unmarried because at the time being unmarried meant that you weren't the property of your husband. You weren't yet purchased. You were, and so that was why it was powerful. It had nothing to do with physicality until centuries and centuries later. I mean, even to the point that they're, I think there was a traditional precedent earlier, but it wasn't until it was translated in English and the word virgin was used that it got the physical sense in a more tangible way.
So it was more that she was an independent woman.
Exactly. She belonged to no man, and that was powerful. So, like, that is still a powerful story. If we go back to the original way that it was written and the original way that it was intended, that is still a powerful story, even without all the things we added to it in the years and generations after. So I don't think that we need to take that away and be like, that's not still a powerful mythology or a story. Like, it still is. We're just, I think we add a bunch of stuff and interpret it differently now.
And if someone is going to come from a deprived, difficult situation and raise a child who then goes on to be fierce and independent and overthrow norms and demand society to adjust to make space for them, it's going to be a strong, independent single mother that does it. Just ask Tupac.
And exactly. And the New Testament authors were writing with a very specific cause. They were opposing the Roman government who destroyed their temple and their city. And what are you going to do in opposition to that? You're going to say, oh, well, okay, I don't want to, be too controversial to people that may be Catholic listening to this, but if we're not going to assume that Mary was physically a virgin, then she was probably raped by a Roman soldier. That was very, very common in those days. So to say, okay, she was not married and she had a son, and that son rose up and was a peaceful protester against the Roman government. Okay, super powerful story. Super powerful story. Like you don't even need to add everything to it for that to still be a powerful story of this unmarried woman. Yeah. It's
origin
great.
Story about a flawed character.
Yes.
Springing from a trauma, right?
Right.
And then fast forward 2,000 years and you've got Batman watching his parents get shot in an alley. No, I mean, I'm not making light of it. I'm just saying that, and this is part of why I love discussing the creative and the artistic interpretations of these ideas about the world and about people, because we really do see that these are our myths, these are our fables, and they've aged with us and they've changed with us, and we've shaped them differently and we've put them into new modern contexts, and in some ways maybe simplified or debased them, and in other ways maybe kind of zhuzhed them up a bit. But like Isis and Osiris and Horus and, a trinity and then another trinity and then into the modern age with our own versions of this. And by the way, there's also a long tradition, I'm sure you came across it, of kind of apocalyptic, I won't harsh the mellow of some very devout religious people, but shall we say apocalyptic predictions that did not come to pass. There's a book by John Michael Greer called Apocalypse Not, about all the times the world was supposed to end and didn't. And in a way, one generous or optimistic way of looking at our dystopian ideas, these dark stories we tell about the world, either in nonfiction or fiction, is humans seem to, among our many traits, be people who love the idea of an impending catastrophe. I mean, in a way, it speaks to our mortality, right? Each of us is a world, and we're born with a tremendous burden of being, at least we believe, the only species that really knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that our world, the world of me, will come to an end. Right. Each of us is living with an impending apocalypse.
Right.
It's the name of our species, Homo sapiens, right? The man who knows. And I think that there's something in us maybe so deep, it's not intellectual, that we deal with the inevitability of our life arc by interpreting it and seeing its reflections and shadows and projections into the world around us, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, that is certainly the case with the Jesus Mary story, which, was originally a story of rising up against your oppressors, and there's still power to these people that were destroyed, which then the exact same story is used 1,000 years later as a way of showing why women needed to be meek and subservient and, hands in prayer and quiet and graceful. The same story is used in so many different ways. So depending on our own interpretation and what we want to see in the world.
Yeah. Did you ever see a film called Jacob's Ladder?
No.
It's a wonderful movie. I mean, probably not going to be on your watch list because it's not an uplifting movie. I mean, in one interpretation, maybe it is. And I won't spoil it by telling you, the twists and turns of the story. But there's a wonderful line spoken by one of the characters where he says that it's a matter of perception, that on the one hand, you might feel that you're assailed by evil spirits who are torturing you because they're taking away all of your attachments to your terrestrial life. But if you think of it differently, then the demons that are torturing you by showing you how the real world, the physical world, doesn't matter, then really they're just angels setting you free. And it's just a matter of how you look at it. And in a way, I guess, our catastrophizing, our emphasis on trauma, our love of the melodramatic and of the apocalyptic, again, it's a matter of perception in a way, right? That when people say we have to save the planet will be fine.
I know.
What we really mean is whatever iteration of human civilization we are currently experiencing may not be stable or sustainable in a new environmental context. Mm-hmm. We are the transient portion of this this earth.
Exactly. Yep. That's why I took so much issue with the Ministry for the Future book, because that is supposed to be, people call it a utopian. I have no idea why it is. But I was so frustrated with it because it's just showing how the climate is making the earth uninhabitable and everybody just dies. I mean, everybody in India just gets cooked because it's too hot in a heat wave and just dies. And the whole time I was reading it, the whole way through, all these people are trying to come up with solutions, geoengineering solutions to try to make the sun less hot. And I was like, literally, this whole book could be solved with one thing: allow people to move. If we didn't have borders, if countries let other people in, then everybody in India could have moved. I mean, the history of, we were just talking about Homo sapiens, the history of all of our life, of like humanity, has been nomadic, moving based on the temperatures of the earth. The fact that we're going to lock somebody in and say they're stuck to live in a place that is too hot or too cold is the problem, not the fact that there are places that are too hot or too cold. Because there are other places that are not.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it from that angle before. That's a good point. I do remember you'd written one of your articles about an idea of a borderless world where people can just kind of like the Walking Dead idea. You wake up one day and suddenly there's no borders, there's no guards telling you you can't go there, you can't move there, no one's going to check your residency papers. And you drew on a study that had shown where people would move to, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what the world would look like, how it would change if borders were not something that prevented people from going where they wanted to go?
Yep.
And your conclusion was?
That if you could live wherever in the world you wanted, you would pick a place that is ideal for you. Maybe if you want to go to college, you pick a place with free education. Maybe if you go move to the Nordic countries. Maybe if you value weather, you go move down to Mexico. Maybe if you want to have a good job, you move to a center where there's a lot of economy. You want free childcare, you can go have a big family, these places. And what that would do is if suddenly, I also predicated my idea on the fact that everything would move to a sales tax rather than an income tax, just because if you're transient and right now the income tax is already a huge problem because I can be living in Spain on a digital nomad visa and be being taxed in Utah, which is getting my money, which is like a silly, because my money should be going to where I'm living. I should be fueling the economy I choose to live in. So in this case, if the borders are open and we and they're all earning money on sales tax, then it's in the country's best interest to be the best place to live, because that's how they'll attract people and money. And if they're not, then everyone will leave. What would happen? I mean, when Russia started to open the conscription, what happened? 100,000 people left and went to Georgia, and Georgia suddenly starts having this bustling economy. All these Russian people that moved in. Well, those people were only able to do that somewhat illegally, so that wasn't available to the larger population. But if that was more legal, if you could move from China to the U.S., if you could move to Russia from the U.S., then what would happen? We would pull the wind out of the sails of some very totalitarian governments nobody wants to live under. And if you were a good place to live, then those places would get better to live because they're richer.
this is where I think the dark, twisted, knotted, gnarled ghoul in the corner of my mind. Just, all I think about is the fact that people move around already, right? We have perhaps long-standing, but we have long-standing debates about migration and immigration around the world. And at least according to the people that tell the story about it, a significant rise in both its prevalence and the volume of people crossing borders. And it's not usually the more open economies that people want to move to that are the ones that are the limiting factor. It's more usually the repressive regimes not wanting to lose their worker base, their tax base.
Right.
So, it
Russia
sounds
and
like
China
a
would have to
lovely
say,
place.
we're not... If the U.S. said the borders are open for you to live here, and Russia and China were still like, no, but you have to stay here, it would still be way easier to move. Trying to keep somebody from leaving someplace is much harder than trying to allow someone to enter it.
Yeah, I think we're possibly moving towards a time where we're going to start having arguments like that more frequently anyway, simply because there are many reasons to discuss some of the reasons you've given, a world where we have a less nationalistic idea of where the locus of control should be over the movement of populations. But at the same time, we do see that where people's passionate concerns lie tend to be where they live, and where the rubber meets the road of meaningful adjustments, it happens on a local level. So, for example, I could speculate that we could be more likely to resolve environmental challenges with meaningful local action protecting waterways and forests and wetlands and so forth than international treaties that simply introduce additional taxes and a kind of trading system between major companies. That's just a theory of mine, but that's kind of what I mean. That this has been a question for a very long time. Who really has the right to be in a place, and who has the right to decide who comes and who goes? And more often than not, it's the gang. Whomever is gathering the tribute of an area decides who comes in and wants people to stay and pay and wants to control against people coming in who are going to challenge their authority.
Right.
And perhaps a time for that mentality is passing and something new might be arising. But whether it would be a better or more sensitive or human-centered idea, maybe I'm more cynical than hopeful.
Well, this is why I loved Matthew Iglesias' book 1 Billion Americans, because he actually takes a very he's pro-immigration. He wants there to be 1 billion Americans, but he makes a kind of conservative case for why we should do that, and that's that India and China have triple, quadruple the people that we do. They're they are going to control the hegemony way sooner than any of us think. And and I think that in the US we're like, well, we have the biggest military, so we will always be in the globally dominant position. But
wait until you have to pit the Navy against China in the South China Sea to defend Taiwan. See how that works out. Exactly.
Like in the next World War II, there's a good chance the U.S. won't win. And it's not because we're not strong enough with our military. It's because we don't have enough people.
Well, and it also wouldn't necessarily mean that the U.S. would be on the wrong side of it in terms of the purpose of a fight like that. That's the risky thing, right? Like The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, a very famous dystopian novel about what would have happened if the Nazis and the Japanese had won the Second World War and divvied up dominance over the U.S., right? It's the winning side that writes the history books.
Exactly.
Another great novel, Fatherland, by Robert Harris, about Nazi Germany winning the Second World War, and it's decades later that a dogged investigator discovers the Holocaust because no one ever found out about it because the Nazis won the war, so nobody ever learned. You know, this is really something that I do think about, that as we see a new movement of jostling for position and a preparation for potentially another global fight over who's going to determine the path of global affairs for the next 100 years, it worries me that the winning side is the one that will write the story of the battle.
Absolutely.
And when we have regimes that, shall we say, are not overtly sympathetic to values that I would consider human-centered and liberal and focused on lifting up individuals and ensuring civil liberties, it's quite worrying to see how powerful they are on paper.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we don't want, I hope it doesn't come to that, but it doesn't even need to come to war for that to be an issue. I mean, if China wants to start, I mean, they already have, I guess, some sort of re-education camps or whatever, some dubious moral things happening, I guess. They could decide that we want to pollute the world a ton and have tons of these re-education camps, and that's totally okay. And there's nothing anybody else in the world can do with it. And in fact, they won't trade with America if America doesn't get on board and start taking some of their hostages and start polluting more. I'm giving a ridiculous example, but I'm just saying, like, our power as a country comes not just from military, but also from trade. We in a lot of ways force China to get better on pollution, because if not, we weren't going to buy from them. You know, we have certain standards we require them to adhere to for us to purchase from them, and that has forced them to act in a certain way. So they could just as easily force us to act in a certain way if they have the economic power, and it's very likely, very easy for them to do that.
Mm. And I'd also propose that the strongest, I would like to believe that the strongest weapon in the American arsenal is the American story. And I think that's really where, no, for real. I would like to think that, because I think that is, in my limited subjective understanding of humans, a more likely reason for people to walk hundreds or thousands of miles, hungry and cold and thirsty, just in order to be illegal and unwelcome in a different place, perhaps where they don't even speak the language. Whether it is absolutely true or not, whether it's justified or not, whether it contains elisions of inconvenient or horrific historical actions, I think we all know the answers to those questions. But the idea that America chose to represent and the story it chose to tell about itself, I believe, is what attracted people there.
Oh yeah, the American dream. That's a powerful story.
Yeah, I mean, there's the old George Carlin joke, right? That, you know why they call it the American dream is because you have to be asleep to believe it.
They say there are other places that you can better achieve the American dream than America. But the fact that America has the story, that's, to your point, that's the most powerful thing.
And it circles back to, you know, where we kind of jumped off is narratives matter, stories matter, mythology matters. And people, for whatever reason, may feel that they are better placed to be free in the self-described land of the free than in a country with more civil liberties. Who knows? And in a way, it feels to me that one of the dystopian trends I see in American politics and society is the inability or unwillingness to both live up to and to continue the telling of that story.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it's an own goal. It's an internal collapse, it's not an outside force per se, or rather, it would be too easy to blame it on a bad actor who's deceiving Americans into hating their own country. I think there's something about a kind of imperial exhaustion. Rome ceases to be a republic, it becomes an empire, and then it just feels hollow and dishonest, and people stop believing in it, and it just falls away. And there's something very poignant about that. And I think that the idea of what America set itself out to mean to people, whether or not it's true, for that to be gone from the world, I think would be an impoverishment. And I really don't want that to sound like a jingoistic or a nationalistic thing, because I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, I mean, like every country, I think it's complex. I think America is unique in that it's maybe one of the first places where so many cultures became one. So I do think it's kind of weird that we call it an American culture now, because whatever we would call an American culture is like 200 years old. And we were all like, then everybody was a bunch of different cultures. So it's like, well, we're just really an example of a global culture. And like, that's kind of what it's just going to look like as more and more people, combine in a place. And this, people will also say like, oh, the westernization of the world is as if everything is becoming more like America. But like, again, America is the mingling of hundreds of other cultures. And the more cultures mingle, the more they become like each other, and they start to speak the same language. And they, you can hail an Uber in France just as you can in the US. Like there are parts of the culture that become homogenized naturally as a result of a mingling of people, because you need to be able to work together and have community together. So I think it's kind of, maybe it is the westernization of the world, but really it's just the globalization of the world as people come together more. That's what it kind of ends up looking like America, because that's what America already did.
Well, so going back to your idea of a world without borders, where people go where they want, in a way, some things globalize before others, maybe.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing that we create our roles based on our ethnicities or where we're from. I think that has had some bad effects too. That's why a lot of people went to wars. A lot of wars are, that kind of.
You could even argue that a lot of the people who migrated to the United States to begin with were leaving places where they were defined by who other people thought they were. Exactly.
It's much better to group ourselves by, oh, we all play the same video game, or like we all go to the same yoga studio, or we're all Substack writers. Like there are better groupings of people than like where we live and our ethnicity.
Well, that's one of the kind of more upbeat side effects of the internet, I think. And in a way, it was its original spirit, the kind of news group, anarchic chat room, buddy idea of whoever you were talking to online was your kind of person because of what you were talking about or what you were interested in. Totally. And it really didn't matter where they were from. And so as we've spent this time together, I'm curious to ask you before we wrap up, your desire for a positive outlook, your emphasis on utopia and hopefulness. So where do you find your hope?
That's an interesting question, because everywhere the world keeps getting better. There are good stories that show us why that is and how that could continue to be. We all have ideas about how we can make it even better from here. Unfortunately, all of our journalism points out all the problems, and a lot of our fiction is dystopian. So even though everything is getting better and there's a lot more better things we can do, we still see the world as a negative place. And this is the doomerism that I am up against in my work.
And from the bottom of my heart, I hope that your candle overcomes the darkness, as they say.
Nothing against dystopian fiction. We just need more utopian fiction to even up the balance a little bit.
Don't get me wrong. I agree with you. I hope that hope can grow and actually meet the world in a meaningful way, rather than just being a kind of nice fantasy about what could be. You know, hope on one side is necessary and useful, and on the other side it can be counterproductive as a distraction. So I think anything that can help us to become more connected to our fellow human beings, more compassionate, more engaged with the real world, and more accepting of reality, as we were saying, about the rough comes with the smooth, not to be catastrophic in our thinking, not to be fixated on our own negative experiences as defining us. You know, some possibility of actually growing in some meaningful way. I think that's something I would hope for.
I'm with you.
Well, Elle, I hope that it's been pleasant speaking to me, because it's definitely been wonderful speaking with you.
Yeah, that was really fun. Thank you. What a conversation. Really covered everything.
Yeah, we definitely stretched our legs there.
War, religion, Nazis, fiction.
You single-handedly disproving Catholicism.
No! I hope that's not the takeaway. This is why I don't want to talk about religion too much.
I'm joking. Obviously that's the bit I'll clip and put out on Twitter. But no, I'm joking.
No, you can if you want.
Well, that's it for this episode of 1984 Today. I'm grateful to our guest Elle Griffin for joining us, and of course to you for listening. Please check the show notes for links to Elle's work, and as usual, if you want to support this podcast, please share widely. Wherever you are, whatever you're up to, keep the fire burning. We'll be back with more fuel next time. Goodbye.